So now in our second chapter on attitude formation, we look a little bit around how our environment, the place where we live, geologically and ideologically shapes our attitudes to many different aspects of our life. So let's imagine that our task would be, for instance, I would be charged with figuring out what type of religion you have. So maybe you have no religion, but maybe you're either Christian or you're Muslim or you're Hindu. How could I figure that out if I'm not allowed to ask you, or for some reason you do not want to tell me? So one way to figure that out is trying to figure out where you're from. Religion is obviously distributed unequally across the world. So in certain areas of the world, people believe in certain types of religions, and in other areas in the world in different types. So one thing I could do is trying to figure out where you are from. But a lot of us travel around the world. There's a lot of immigration. I do not live in the place I was born. I haven't lived in a place I was born for a very long time. So maybe that might not help. Another good way for me to figure out what type of religion you have is to look what the religion of your parents are or your friends. So often a lot of the attitudes that we have are simply taken over or adopted from what our parents have and the social group, our in-group that we are surrounded by. Right? So most likely people share the religion they have with their parents. And as a social psychologist, that makes a lot of sense. For us, religion has the big function to bind groups, bigger groups together. It binds us not only to our family, but also to our community. And it can thereby overcome, for instance, ethnical and other borders. So that makes sense, but this is something, it's kind of obvious, but it's important to stress that we often just basically adopt the attitudes that people have around us. And there are certain mechanisms about that. And some argue now that in a lot of Western societies where religiosity is declining steeply and more people become atheists, maybe this kind of lack of attitude shaping and forming and behavior informing role that religion plays in different parts and other parts of the world is now kind of occupied by the political ideology we have, and we'll come to that back later. So now let's look at one kind of very obvious, or not very obvious, kind of like one interesting phenomenon. It's called evaluative conditioning. So when my wife first, before she started her academic career, she worked in fashion, and I learned a lot about how fashion people think about evaluative conditioning. So for instance, on the right side, you see a rack of clothes. And so when she used to work for a kind of like a high-end Japanese fashion label, they would go into the shops and would tell the shops, if you want to sell our stuff, then you can't place us on a rack with these and these brands. No, you have to place us either on our own, or with these brands. We don't want to be associated with these brands. Also, if you want to do a sale, we are not doing sales. Just send all the stuff back. And then they would actually send that stuff back. The shops and the people at that small Japanese luxury label would cut the pieces apart. They also didn't want to give them away because they didn't want to be associated with the right kind of people. They want to be only seen in certain contexts we worn by certain people. So why do they do that? And one, like as a psychologist, the phenomenon that is associated with that is that of evaluative conditioning, okay? That I basically try to change the attitude you have, or that influence the attitude you have by pairing it with certain other stimuli. So in a classic example of how we would do this, and it's not a classic example, let's say an adoption of the example experimental psychologists use, we could try to improve the attitude you guys have towards Elliot. Here's Elliot. Let's say Elliot got his evaluations back and he finds that people kind of, or that you guys feel somewhat lukewarm towards him. Now he hires me and says, Andreas, you as a social psychologist, how can you influence the attitude these students have towards me? He's like, oh, you know what? I will just, under the pretense of social psychology lab experience, invite them all in the lab. And what I will do, I will show them a picture of you. And thereafter, very often, I would show positive images like here of the beach. Often people in experimental settings that are not centered around increasing the attitude you guys have towards Elliot, people would just take words with words. So you would see something like Elliot and an ice cream, and Elliot and beach, and Elliot and I don't know what else is positive, cake, flowers, etc. You get the idea. And then what you can see when you test the attitude again is by pairing the picture of Elliot or the word of Elliot with positive other stimuli, you increase the positivity of that that we feel towards that attitude object. So think about for a moment what this adds to the mere exposure effect. Think a little bit about what how advertisement that uses. So in one way we learned in a chapter beforehand that merely being exposed to something, having a direct experience with that increases our liking for that. But now if you're like an advertiser, what you can do is you cannot just merely show, for instance, the laundry detergent, but you can couple it somewhat even randomly with positive things. So you could see an attractive person, an attractive house that is at the beach using our not yet, but soon to be beloved laundry detergent. That would be an approach where we could use basically where advertisement uses that a lot, but randomly coupling. So sometimes, for instance, you might see advertisement where you say like, why is this person standing in front of an expensive car trying to sell you, for instance, like an energy drink, right? And there's an attractive model holding an energy drink in front of a car. And this is the idea. By evaluative conditioning, you will like now that energy drink more because it's paired in the environment with positive stimuli. And this is kind of like one route of how environment shapes us, right? We're kind of, there's certain rules, there's certain guidelines that we follow. They can be implicit or explicit, right? There could be no bicycles, please. If I put my bicycle here, then conditioning will happen. Someone's like, hey, take your bicycle away. Now, this is like a form of operant conditioning. And so I get kind of punished for being, putting my bike there. And now the likelihood that I do this again will be decreased. Or there could be something like, be nice, don't be mean. This is a rule in most societies. So if I act nicely, I get rewarded. And hence, this is my liking for being nice to others becomes almost habitual. And I'm nice because I was rewarded so much for my niceness in the past. So for instance, if you're a parent, you might say like, oh, you shared your toys. That's so wonderful. Here you have an ice cream or a lolly or something like that, right? So there's like conditioning constantly happening, and you can easily apply that to many different contexts yourself. But there's something that kind of grew out of that, and some research that you're most likely already familiar with. This is like, it's not just directly experience reward and punishment. It's not just mainly operational conditioning. There's a little bit classical conditioning, but it's not so much important for the social world. Operant conditioning is more important. But you know probably this experiment from a different context, kind of like one of the experiments that put basically a nail into the coffin for behaviorism, and that's the bubble doll experiment by Albert Bandura, but maybe not. So what happened in this experiment? These are our original pictures. So one group of children would come into the lab in Stanford, and they would basically on a TV see another grown-up punching a doll, the Bobo doll. I think the picture is not very good that I took here the screenshot from the video. I strongly encourage you to watch the video that is in the description on our module description. It's in the description for this week. It's very worthwhile seeing. But here they see, speaking of seeing, the children see a grown-up punching a doll. It's kind of like an inflatable doll. The doll comes back, they punch it, they're aggressive, and so forth. And thereafter, the children will be led into a room with the same doll. And you can kind of see that then the children who saw an adult being aggressive towards that doll also become aggressive. So simply observing a certain behavior has a positive influence on our behavior. There's also something what's called vicarious reinforcement. You can just see somebody else being reinforced or punished, and this will have a similar effect than directly experience it. So here, right, you can immediately see why this experiment is so famous, why it has such a big cultural impact, because because this is like, if I see something on TV, right? If I see people being violent and being rewarded, adored, showered with money because they did something violent, then this will have an impact on a child watching it, and we have to be careful of what the content we show. This is one kind of implication for that. For us, it's just like in terms of learning and forming our attitudes, it is really important to think about, right? What we see, what our children see, what our friends see has an impact on their attitude. It's not only just merely seeing what other people do, that has an impact, but also thinking about or observing the consequences of that. So observational learning is a real powerful mechanism of forming attitudes in our society. Speaking of really powerful mechanism, right? I want to end this and talk a little bit about ideology. I teased it at the beginning of this chapter. So you can just like similar to religion, you can see that now more and more in the Western societies, the political ideology replaces religious rules and guidance and restrictions we have on our life, right? You can think about here, you see a picture of people demonstrating against the lockdown in London. You can immediately kind of have an idea what political orientation is more likely to attend this demonstration and which will be less likely to attend that, right? And this is not obvious whether you're a conservative or Labour kind of affiliated with each of these parties. It's not obvious whether you should have this or that stance towards the coronavirus and the lockdown, right? It is often that we feel kind of like by basically association with our group or the other group that we like or dislike certain things. And we will talk more about this when we talk about in-group, out-group effects. But it's really important to think about that often, and this is why people are so concerned about polarization and intensifying of the political polarization in the US, but also in other countries, as we have seen in the, I think in the second chapters, that the ideology doesn't stop only with political things, but it influences many other areas, right? You can think about a person who's vegan or a person who really loves meat. You can immediately see like which ideology they might be affiliated with. There are certain areas you like or don't like. There are certain behaviors you show, certain cars, certain outfits, etc. All of that is kind of infused with ideology. And I think it's important to be aware of that, and it's important to be aware that this is a strong factor that shapes the attitudes and we have in our lives.